A police captain sits in the courtroom. He is charged with murder. The victim is his ex-wife. She is a doctor and had been shot 6 times. The prosecution's main evidence is a bite mark. The police captain leans forward. He removes his dentures and places them on the table. The question in court now: how hard can you bite with dentures? Ohio is a state in the American Midwest, shaped by farmland, forests, rivers, and the proximity to Lake Erie in the north. The landscape is varied but restrained, without extreme contrasts. The climate follows clear seasons, with cold winters and humid summers. In the late 1990s, Ohio was undergoing a slow economic transition. For much of the 20th century, the state had depended heavily on manufacturing, but many factories had closed or reduced operations. This meant change rather than collapse. Many communities continued with stable daily routines and strong local ties. Crime levels in Ohio were generally in line with national averages. In the late 1990s, violent crime in the United States was declining overall, although differences between areas were significant. Serious violent crimes were relatively uncommon in everyday life and attracted great attention when they occurred. Akron is located in northeastern Ohio and had long been known as a center for rubber and tire manufacturing. By the late 1990s, the city's industrial peak had passed, but it still functioned as a regional center for employment, education, and healthcare. The city consisted of distinct residential areas, suburbs, and a downtown that no longer carried the same economic weight as before. Many residents lived predictable daily lives, shaped by work, family, and community. In and around Akron, there were large green spaces and natural areas, including what later became Cuyahoga Valley National Park. The closeness between city, suburb, and nature was noticeable, and a natural part of life for many residents. Crime in Akron was unevenly distributed. Some areas faced greater social and economic challenges, while others were seen as stable and safe. Serious violent crime did not dominate daily life, which made such events stand out clearly when they occurred. Margo Prade was born in 1956 and grew up in Akron, Ohio. She was the youngest in a large family, with 6 sisters and 1 brother. In the family, she was sometimes called the runt of the litter and chipmunk, nicknames referring to her short hag, H.T. Despite being the smallest, she took up space early on. At just 4 years old, Margo said she would become a doctor. This was not laughed off. Her siblings believed in her, and Margo held on to that goal throughout her upbringing. At school, she stood out clearly. She attended Central Howard High School in Akron and graduated in 1975 as valedictorian, the student with the highest grades in the entire class. She then began studying at Kent State University, where she earned her bachelor's degree through an accelerated program. In 1983, she received her medical degree from Northeast Ohio Medical University. When Margo became a doctor, her personality did not change. One of her sisters, Veronica Sadler, later said that Margo jokingly told her she could no longer use the nicknames in public. But, within the family, she remained the same person. Margo chose to work in family medicine. She loved children and opened her own practice on Wooster Avenue in Akron. Over time, she built a patient list of around 7,000 people. Friends described her as a doctor who went far beyond what was expected. If a patient could not afford their medication, Margo would pay for it herself. If a child was allergic to infant formula, she made sure to find special solutions. In 1979, Margo married Doug Prade. She was in her early 20s, and he was 10 years older. Her mother expressed concern about the age difference, but Margo replied that she trusted him, especially while she was in medical school. Together they had 2 daughters, Kenya and Sahara. Margo kept her children active. Kenya devoted herself to gymnastics and competed at a national level. Sahara was drawn more to the performing arts, including singing, guitar, drums, and acting, and attended Miller South School for Visual and Performing Arts in Akron. Friends have said that some questioned how much Margo let her children do. Her response was simple: "What else are they supposed to do? Watch television." In the family, Margo was the one who held everything together. She organized barbecues, gift exchanges at Christmas, and family gatherings. Her sister described her as the one who always took responsibility, even in everyday details, sometimes with humor, such as when she always managed to burn something on the grill. In April 1997, Margo Prade and Doug Prade divorced after a long marriage. By this time, the relationship between them had deteriorated significantly. According to people close to Margo, the divorce was not unexpected, but it was emotionally heavy. After the divorce, Margo changed. Friends said that she lost about 30 pounds, or around 13 kilograms, during the spring and summer of 1997. She began dating again and took steps toward a new life, both privately and emotionally. At the same time, she continued her work as a doctor. Her practice in Akron remained active, and she was deeply committed to her patients. She held on to daily routines and to her responsibilities, both as a doctor and as a mother. The relationship with Doug remained strained even after the divorce. A close friend, Donzella Anuskowitz, later recalled that Margo expressed concern about him. Margo said that Doug had told her he would kill her if she divorced him. When her friend questioned whether she truly believed he would do such a thing, Margo replied that he might, and that no one would then know that it was him. There was also concern among Margo's family and friends. They felt that the relationship had become increasingly problematic, and that Margo carried a fear she had not had before. At the same time, she tried to create safety and stability for her daughters. At the same time, Margo began a relationship with Tim Holston, an attorney from Columbus. According to Anushkiewicz, Margo was very happy in the relationship. She was described as hopeful and positive. The couple planned to tell Margo's family about their engagement at Thanksgiving that year. There were also thoughts of change in life as a whole. Margo had mentioned to friends that she was considering moving to Columbus. According to Anushkiewicz, she saw it as a way to create distance and calm. Those who knew the situation considered the idea reasonable. During this time, Margo continued to hold the family together. She remained present in her daughters' lives and kept her routines as a mother. She organized family gatherings and maintained contact with her siblings and her mother. Outwardly, life functioned. She worked, was engaged in her children, and looked ahead. But several people close to her also carried a growing concern, a sense that something was not right, even as daily life continued. On the morning of November 26, 1997, the day before Thanksgiving, Margo Prade was shot to death in her car in the parking lot outside her medical office in Akron, Ohio. She had just arrived at work and was still seated in the driver's seat when the shooter approached the vehicle and fired 6 shots with a .38 caliber revolver. The murder weapon was never found, and there were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting itself. A surveillance camera in the area showed Margo driving in and parking her van. The camera also showed another vehicle nearby and, after the murder, a blurry figure moving away from the scene and driving off. The footage was too unclear to identify either a person or a vehicle and could not be used to point to a suspect. During the autopsy, a clear bite mark was discovered on Margo's left arm. The mark went through both her blouse and her lab coat and was determined to have occurred directly in connection with the violence. This bite mark would become one of the most central and controversial elements of the entire legal process. The investigation began under difficult conditions. The murder weapon was missing. No usable fingerprints from the perpetrator could be secured. There was no DNA evidence at the time that could be analyzed in a way that gave a clear answer. The crime scene, therefore, provided few direct technical answers. The police quickly determined that the murder was targeted. Nothing was missing from the car. There were no signs of robbery or random violence. The focus, therefore, turned to Margo's closest relationships. At the time of the murder, Margo had recently divorced her husband, Douglas Prade, a police chief in Akron. The divorce had been conflict-filled and was finalized in April 1997, 7 months before the murder. The investigation showed that the relationship had remained strained after the divorce. Margo had expressed fear of Douglas to friends. She had changed the locks on her home and installed an alarm system. At the same time, it emerged that Douglas had secretly recorded a large number of her phone calls without her knowledge. These recordings later became the subject of separate criminal investigations but were also used by the prosecution to describe a pattern of control. The police also examined financial motives. It was established that Margo had a life insurance policy of $75,000, in which Douglas Prade was the beneficiary. During the investigation, documents were found in which Douglas calculated his debts in relation to this amount. The prosecution later used this as part of the motive narrative, but the defense argued that the sum was relatively low and could not by itself explain a murder. When the police arrived at the parking lot outside the medical office on November 26, 1997, it was clear that something violent had occurred. Margo Prade was still seated in the driver's seat of her van. She had been shot 6 times. The murder weapon was not at the scene. There were no witnesses who saw the shooting itself, no clear fingerprints, no person who could identify a perpetrator. From the very beginning, investigators faced a problem. They had very little to work with. It was only later, when the body was examined more closely, that one of the few physical traces that would come to dominate the entire legal process was discovered. On Margo's left arm, there was a mark. It is partly hidden by the lab coat and the blouse. When the clothes are removed, it becomes clearer. An impression in the skin. Irregular, but still distinct. The forensic pathologist determines that it is a bite mark. This is not a small scratch. The mark goes through both fabric and skin. It was made with force. The assessment is that it occurred directly in connection with the violence. In a case where almost everything else is missing, this immediately becomes important. The police's first interpretation. For the police, the bite mark is an unusual finding. In firearm murders, it is not common for the perpetrator to get close enough to the victim for a bite to occur. But it also says something about the situation in the car. The theory becomes that the perpetrator was very close to Margo Prade. Perhaps there was a struggle. Perhaps the bite was a way to control her. Perhaps it occurred in panic or frustration. There are no certain answers. But for the first time, there is something that can be documented, measured, and compared. The police carefully photograph the bite mark. Pictures are taken from several angles. The mark is measured. The clothing is documented. Plaster casts are made. Then comes the next step. The comparisons begin. If this is a bite mark, then it must have been caused by someone's teeth. And if the mark can be compared with a suspect's dental structure, then perhaps someone can be tied to the murder. Douglas Prade, Margo's former husband, becomes a central figure in the investigation early on, not only because of the relationship, but also because there is now a physical trace that can potentially be compared. But he is not the only one examined. The police take dental impressions from several people who appear in the investigation at an early stage. These are compared with the bite mark. No one else is assessed as providing a match that leads further. The focus narrows. Douglas Prade's teeth are documented. Impressions are taken. These are sent to forensic odontologists for analysis. By the end of the 1990s, forensic odontology, especially bite mark analysis, is considered an accepted method in American courts. It is used in several high-profile cases. The method is based on the idea that each person's dental structure is unique, and that a bite mark can therefore function as a kind of fingerprint. But the method is far from exact. Bite marks can change depending on how hard the bite is, whether the victim moves, how the skin is stretched, whether clothing is in the way, how quickly the mark is documented. Despite this, the analysis is brought into the investigation with great weight. When Douglas Prade is arrested and later charged with the murder of his former wife Margo Prade, he is clear about one thing. He says that he was not at the parking lot outside her medical office that morning. He says that he was somewhere else. Douglas Prade states that he was at a gym on the morning of November 26, 1997. A gym located in Akron, about 6 minutes by car from Margo's medical office. This becomes his main alibi. The murder occurred in the morning, but the exact time is never established in public documentation. There is no timestamp for the shots. No one heard them. No one saw them. This means that the alibi cannot be tested against an exact minute. Instead, the police must work backward. When Margo is seen on the surveillance camera as she parks, how long it takes before she is found, how long it takes to drive between different locations. This creates a time window. And within that time window, both the gym and the crime scene fit. Douglas Prade says that he worked out at the gym that morning. He says that he used the exercise equipment and then took a shower. After that, he says he drove on. He denies that he left the gym to commit the murder and then returned. He denies that he was at Margo's medical office at all that morning. The defense chooses to rely heavily on this alibi. Witnesses from the gym. The defense calls witnesses to support Douglas's account. The first witness says that he saw Douglas at the gym that morning. But when asked about the exact time, he cannot answer. He does not remember whether it was early in the morning, mid-morning, or exactly when. The second witness is even more uncertain. He cannot say with certainty that he saw Douglas at all that morning. None of the witnesses can give an exact time that places Douglas at the gym at the same time the murder is believed to have occurred. There is also no electronic evidence, no check-in logs, no receipts, no surveillance cameras from the gym, no timestamps from the equipment. Everything is based on memory. The prosecution's challenge. The prosecution attacks the alibi in several ways. First, they point to the distance. The gym is only a few minutes' drive from Margo's medical office. Even if Douglas was at the gym at some point, it cannot be ruled out that he left the gym, drove to the office, committed the murder, and then continued his day. Second, the prosecution points to the uncertainty of the witnesses. No witness can place Douglas at the gym at an exact time that makes it impossible for him to be the perpetrator. Third, the prosecution raises Douglas's behavior later that same morning. When Douglas Prade arrives at the crime scene after being informed of the murder, police perceive that he appears freshly showered. His hair is wet. He is wearing clean clothes. The prosecution uses this to support the theory that he may have showered after the murder, not necessarily after exercising. This is not technical evidence, but it is presented as a circumstance. The defense strongly objects. They say it is normal to shower after working out. That wet hair proves nothing. That the prosecution is building insinuations, not facts. They remind the jury that no one can place Douglas at the crime scene that morning. That no one saw him there. That no camera shows him there. They argue that it is the prosecution that must prove the alibi is false, not Douglas who must prove that it is true. One of the biggest problems with the gym alibi is the time aspect. The trial is held in 1998. The witnesses are asked about an ordinary weekday morning that occurred more than a year earlier. None of them knew that morning would become important. No one had reason to note the exact time. No one wrote anything down. This is something the defense emphasizes heavily. How reliable is a memory of an ordinary situation, long afterward? The prosecution responds that this applies to all parts of the case, including witnesses who placed Douglas near the crime scene. The prosecution focuses on the bite mark and calls several forensic dental experts. One of them, Dr. Lowell Levine, expresses himself cautiously. He says that the bite mark is consistent with Douglas Prade's dental structure. This does not mean that he says Douglas definitely caused the mark, but that Douglas cannot be excluded. Another state expert goes further. He says that the bite mark matches Douglas Prade's teeth. In the courtroom, this has a strong effect. To the jury, it sounds like a direct connection between Douglas and the murder. The prosecution's narrative is clearly formed here. This is not a random mark. It is not just anyone, it is him. The defense realizes early that the bite mark is dangerous. If the jury accepts the odontological analysis, the entire case risks being decided there. The defense therefore calls its own expert, Dr. Peter Baum. He says something completely different. Douglas Prade had, at the time of the murder, a poorly fitting upper dental prosthesis. According to Baum, this makes it very unlikely that Douglas could have caused such a strong and clear bite mark. The prosthesis would, according to him, move or come loose during such a bite. The defense also questions the reliability of the entire method. They point out that skin is not a stable material, that marks change, that two experts can look at the same mark and draw different conclusions. The problem is that the bite mark is not just one piece of evidence among many. It is the only physical evidence that is claimed to directly link Douglas Prade to the murder. There is no murder weapon, no fingerprints, no DNA, no surveillance image that identifies him, no eyewitnesses who saw him shoot. The prosecution presents other circumstances: the relationship, the divorce, the life insurance policy. But it is the bite mark that gives the investigation its weight. The defense repeatedly tries to remind the jury of this. If the bite mark falls, everything falls. When the jury goes to deliberate, they weigh everything they have heard. They have seen the images, they have heard the experts. They have heard two completely different interpretations of the same mark. At the time of the trial, there is no DNA analysis of the bite mark. The technology is not used. The question of saliva DNA is never raised before the jury. It would take many years before this would become decisive. But in the courtroom in 1998, the bite mark is enough. Why the gym alibi was not enough. When the jury weighs the gym alibi, they do not do so in isolation. They see it together with the bite mark. The relationship between Margo and Douglas, the life insurance policy, the secret recordings, testimony about behavior before and after the divorce. The gym alibi does not become exculpatory evidence. It becomes an uncertain factor. It does not exclude guilt. And in a case built on circumstantial evidence, that is enough for the prosecution. The jury determines that the gym alibi does not create reasonable doubt. They find that Douglas Prade may have been at the gym at some point, but that this does not exclude that he also had the opportunity to commit the murder. It is not proven that he was at the gym at the exact time when the murder occurred, and in the eyes of the jury, that is sufficient. When the case is later reviewed again, many years later, the gym alibi is raised once more in discussion, not as proof of innocence, but as an example of how the entire case rested on uncertain timelines and memories. But in the first trial in 1998, it does not carry enough weight. The jury deliberates, and after about 6 hours they return. Douglas Prade is convicted of murder. The sentence is life imprisonment. At this point, everyone involved believed the case was solved and justice served. But decades of legal proceedings would follow. What today makes the case known is not only that a doctor and mother was murdered outside her workplace, that two children lost both their parents in different ways, and that a police chief was sentenced to life in prison for the murder. When Douglas Prade was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1998, the case was regarded from the perspective of the justice system as closed. The conviction was upheld by the Court of Appeals in the year 2000. At that point, it was still the bite mark that was considered the strongest link between Douglas and the murder of Margo Prade. But already early on, the bite mark evidence began to be questioned in broader legal and scientific circles. In the years after the trial, criticism of forensic odontology as a method grew. Several cases in the United States where bite mark evidence had been used were later shown to have led to wrongful convictions. Douglas Prade continued throughout his imprisonment to maintain his innocence. He applied repeatedly for new trials, but was denied. A decisive shift came when DNA technology developed. At the time of the murder in 1997, DNA analysis was limited. The bite mark was analyzed only visually and through comparison of dental impressions. No genetic analyses were performed at the scene. Years later, when technology had improved, the question arose of whether DNA could be recovered from the area around the bite mark. The defense argued that if the bite mark had truly been caused by a bite, then there should be saliva DNA from the perpetrator. After a long legal battle, new testing was allowed. When DNA was analyzed from the bite mark area, the results did not show Douglas Prade's DNA. Instead, DNA was identified that could not be linked to him. This became one of the most disruptive points in the entire case. The prosecution objected, arguing that the DNA results did not necessarily exclude Douglas as the perpetrator. They claimed that the DNA could have been contaminated or transferred in another way, and that the absence of DNA did not in itself prove innocence. The defense argued that this undermined the entire evidence on which the jury had based its conviction. In the year 2011, the Ohio Innocence Project took on Douglas Prade's case. The organization focuses on cases where new scientific evidence can show that a conviction is wrongful. Their review of the case pointed to several problems. That the bite mark evidence had been decisive despite lacking solid scientific foundation. That the DNA results now contradicted the state's theory. That no other technical evidence tied Douglas to the murder. The Innocence Project argued that the jury had never heard this information, and that the conviction therefore could not be considered legally sound. In the year 2013, a judge in Summit County made a historic decision. After reviewing the DNA results and the new scientific understanding of bite marks, the judge ruled that Douglas Prade had shown actual innocence. This was an extremely rare legal determination. The judge stated that the evidence now available did not merely create reasonable doubt, but actively showed that Douglas did not commit the crime. Douglas Prade was released from prison after more than 15 years. The decision was immediately met with resistance from the prosecution. The state of Ohio appealed the ruling, arguing that the judge had gone too far in the assessment. The prosecution's position was that the DNA results did not prove who committed the murder, that other circumstantial evidence could still point to Douglas, that the bite mark was not the sole basis of the 1998 conviction, but part of a larger whole. In the year 2014, an appellate court overturned the decision of actual innocence. The court ruled that even though new evidence could call the conviction into question, it did not meet the legal requirements to establish actual innocence. Douglas Prade was returned to prison. The case continued all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which chose not to take up the case. As a result, the appellate court's decision stood. Douglas Prade remained imprisoned, but the legal process had already changed how the case was viewed in legal circles. The role of bite mark evidence in convictions was openly questioned, and the Prade case became a frequently cited example in legal literature. Despite decades of investigation, several questions have never received definitive answers. Who left the DNA at the bite mark? Who was the blurry figure on the surveillance footage? For example, motion analysis should be able to rule out whether it is even possible that it was Douglas or not. Doug himself has theories that it could have been an unknown serial killer who was active in the area at the time. During the same period, there were 3 additional murders of women in the area that were never solved. Douglas Prade is still in prison. In the year 2019, his daughter Kenya died of cancer. He was not allowed to see her before she died.